Hey there, last week's video on Joe Biden's Afghanistan victory generated a ton of excellent comments. So I figured I might as well do a part 2. Today, I think it makes sense to enlarge a little on why I think this move is so great for both Afghanistan and the United States, and to explain how a similar policy could really help Syria. My main focus in part 1 was something that has been covered very eloquently in mainstream reporting. For 20 years, rural Afghanistan, the Afghanistan where 75% of Afghans live, was terrorized from the air. Bombs from the US and proxy Afghan government were a constant risk. Military documents from recently convicted whistleblower Daniel Hale indicate that as many as 90% of the people killed by drones in Afghanistan were not the intended targets. In 2019, even the New York Times admitted that the US and its proxies killed more civilians than the Taliban did. And that's according to the fraudulent math and often comically bad intelligence that the US government uses to exonerate itself. According to the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and now even the Wall Street Journal, a sort of miraculous calm has now descended on the Afghan countryside. The Taliban is cruel, but it also brought peace, and that is a wonderful thing. Many have brought my attention to the fact that there is still violence in Afghanistan. ISIS-K has claimed responsibility for Friday's horrific bombing of a mosque in Kunduz. Terrorism still exists in Afghanistan, but it seems transparently obvious to me that the Taliban will be better at fighting these insurgent groups than the United States ever was. Now, people have often told me that I don't persuade anybody by characterizing arguments as stupid, so I won't do that. I will say that at this point in time, to believe that the US government is good at fighting insurgencies in foreign countries, you have to ignore the past 20 years of history and basic logic. Let me draw you a picture. Assad of Syria and the Taliban of Afghanistan are two actors that really couldn't be more different. But the structure of the counter-terror problem in these countries is very similar. They are nasty actors, but both governments have demonstrated extraordinary tenacity, and they would not have survived the past decades without some degree of local legitimacy. The Washington, D.C. argument, in both Afghanistan and Syria, is that actually the U.S. military would be better at fighting the Islamic State than these tenacious, brutal governments with local legitimacy and knowledge. This is the U.S. military that functions as an unwelcome outside invader in both countries. It is an institution that has resolutely refused to learn anything about the languages, cultures, or histories of the people we have been bombing for 20 years. Oh yeah, it's also got a demonstrated history of failure over the past 2 decades. But none of these are the silliest parts of the argument. No, the silliest part of the Washington, D.C. argument is that the U.S. military will somehow do a better job of fighting ISIS in these countries while also fighting the government that controls the majority of the territory. This is flatly absurd. Instead of letting the local strongmen crush these insurgencies, something which is very much in their interest to do, the U.S. comes in and tries to fight everybody. A simple sense of logic or geometry could tell you that the situation Washington, D.C. wants is guaranteed to be more unstable and violent. History will tell you this as well. Washington, D.C. loves to talk about how we defeated the Islamic State by teaming up with a bunch of socialist Kurdish militias, and all it cost us was the friendship of Turkey, a top 20 economy and a steadfast NATO ally. But what Washington, D.C. really doesn't like to talk about is the fact that the Islamic State was basically a U.S. proxy before we decided to start fighting it. I've got a video that talks about this at length that I'll link at the end of this one, but briefly, it's pretty obvious if you just look at the timeline. The Islamic State didn't solidify as a territorial entity in Syria and Iraq until 2014, almost 3 years after Obama had declared Assad an official enemy, and after the United States and our allies had poured billions into arming every jihadist we could find in northern Syria. Washington, D.C. loves to pretend that it was our withdrawal from Iraq that created the Islamic State, leaving out the inconvenient facts that the Islamic State took its first territories in Syria, with weapons that the CIA and our allies had provided to them in a region that was ungoverned because of U.S. policy. We do not stop insurgencies. We create them with our presence. These unstable situations, with the United States trying to fight the local government and the Islamic State at the same time, do not bring peace and safety. In fact, it's situations like this that create and perpetuate insurgencies like the Islamic State. Sadly, insanely, this situation persists in Syria. The past 4 years have demonstrated that final defeat of ISIS is impossible as long as the U.S. presence keeps Syria unstable. As the growing peace in Afghanistan has demonstrated, it's the U.S. presence that is the main problem. I expect that Biden's heroic withdrawal from Afghanistan will allow the Taliban to stamp out the mosque bombers and do so rather quickly. If Lindsey Graham and the rest of Washington, D.C. can be restrained from starting a new civil war in Afghanistan, that is. There is an argument against U.S. withdrawal that I do not make fun of. It is undeniable that there are certain classes of Afghan women that will lose rights in a Taliban-run state. I've had many fruitless arguments over this in the comments and honestly with myself as well. How do you balance the rights of women against the right to live without war? It is a very serious question. All week, commenters have been telling me that Afghanistan under the Taliban will become a rape camp with young women forced into marriage. This is a horrible future to contemplate, but it's important to point out that this is also kind of Afghanistan's reality. The country has among the highest fertility rates in the world. Over the past 2 decades of U.S. occupation, the country's population has almost doubled. No country that puts up numbers like that is a feminist paradise. In fact, I think it's probably fair to characterize what's happening in Afghanistan already as a rape camp. The fact that the United States was running this camp didn't mean better results for the vast majority of Afghan women. I suspect that it might be possible that Taliban rule could improve women's rights. Because what the Taliban might be able to provide is peace and unity. The U.S. built a lot of schools and had a lot of programs to help women. But what did that matter if U.S. control was never established over the countryside for more than a year at most? Most of Afghanistan's population is rural, after all. If the U.S. allows NGOs to work with the Taliban throughout a unified Afghanistan, the international community's ability to access and aid Afghan women will dramatically improve, not get worse. Oh, and in Syria, it's quite straightforward. The United States and our Turkish ally remain the biggest funders of the most violently anti-women factions in the war, including Al-Qaeda. Assad is a brutal dictator, but he's always been secular and somewhat Western-oriented. The clear feminist position in the Syrian war is to withdraw U.S. troops as soon as possible, as well as lifting sanctions. To be honest, I could be wrong about U.S. withdrawal being the best possible thing for the Afghan people. I don't think I'm wrong, but I could be. What I do know I am right about is that this move has been phenomenal for the U.S. public, for U.S. prestige, and the U.S. balance sheet. One of the most ridiculous things I read in September was an attempt to compare the Suez Crisis, a dramatic humiliation for the British Empire, to the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. I happen to be a little obsessed with the Suez Crisis, and I have a description of it that I published a number of years back. Historians favor many different dates for the end of the British Empire. But for me, the one that makes the most sense is 1956, with an event that we know as the Suez Crisis in the West. In 1956, Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt. It was a classic piece of imperial skullduggery. Supposedly, in the name of peace, Britain took back the Suez Canal that Egypt had just nationalized. It looked like a success. Then the United States intervened. This intervention in the Suez Crisis didn't involve a single U.S. soldier. U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower decided that he had no interest in backing this 19th century play from fading European powers. He simply told the British that if they continued their occupation, he would no longer support the British pound. sending their country into bankruptcy. The British had to back down, even though they had complete military dominance of the situation. This destroyed British prestige forever. Though only 16 British soldiers died, it was the end of the empire. After 1956, if the British wanted to look like a big deal on the world stage, they could only do it by allying with the United States. Independent British power in the world ended with the Suez Crisis. Well, both historical events did involve withdrawals, but I see the U.S. situation as more of an anti-Suez. It's a sign that the U.S. world system is capable of evolving and abandoning old approaches, and might be prepared to retain its semi-hegemonic power for decades to come. While the Suez Crisis was a disastrous failure that highlighted the outmodedness and end of the British Empire. Suez was about Britain not getting the point. It was about Prime Minister Anthony Eden in particular failing to recognize that 19th century imperial tactics were no longer appropriate to the 20th century. And importantly, somebody else had to force Britain to get the message. They didn't choose to withdraw, Eisenhower forced them to. In the US, it was the US public and two presidents we elected, Trump and Biden, who forced the Pentagon to give up its shitty little 19th century empire of rape and wedding bombs. And nobody else forced us to do it. Our European allies all threw temper tantrums over our withdrawal, and even our rivals were shocked and dismayed. We chose to leave Afghanistan because we could see that our old patterns were a waste of time. Nobody forced us to do it. We have already saved billions of dollars, and over the decade to come, we've probably saved trillions. We have not just freed up resources that will help us hold on to world leadership, we have, for the first time in a long time, provided evidence that we might be smart enough to hold on to world leadership. Withdrawal from Afghanistan isn't a sign of American decline, it's a sign of American renewal. As much as I object, personally and philosophically, to recent developments in Asia, they are a clear sign that U.S. power is increasing, not declining. Australia has eagerly signed up for U.S. naval bases and U.S. nuclear submarines at some point in the future. China has meekly acquiesced to the stunning news that there are U.S. soldiers in Taiwan, and they've been there for over a year. I wish we would use our power with more responsibility and restraint, but it's clear that withdrawing from Afghanistan was a shot of adrenaline for U.S. power and prestige. Oh, and by the way, just in case you're laboring under the illusion that China has been violating Taiwanese airspace for the past couple weeks, I would humbly suggest that you read more articles and fewer deceptive headlines. That's not actually what's happening. Leaving Syria would be even better for U.S. power and prestige. We are currently maintaining an incredibly unstable system that drains our resources, makes it easy for the Islamic State to flourish in the chaos, and always presents the possibility of another trillion-dollar war with Iran if they decide to blow up one of our bases. If we left, the multipolar conflict would quickly become a much simpler bipolar one. This colder conflict would keep Russia and Turkey busy, lead to the quick annihilation of the Islamic State remnants, and cost us nothing. It's yet another opportunity that's just waiting for the United States to pick it up, by quite literally doing nothing. One of the classic U.S. militarist lines of the early century was, "Decline is a choice." The implication of this motto was that if we opted not to garrison half of Eurasia, then we were choosing decline. 20 years of miserable experience now makes it clear that the exact opposite is true. Decline is a choice we made by setting up a multi-trillion-dollar 19th century empire in Afghanistan. Decline is a choice we continue to make by keeping troops in Syria and Iraq instead of spending that money on infrastructure at home. I am delighted that we seem to finally have a U.S. president who is capable of making better choices. But I'd like to see those choices come faster, please. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and click the bell next to the subscribe button if you'd like to get notifications whenever I upload a new video. Thanks.